In the dead of night, the night janitor of St. Paul's Hospital walks on his head, his body twisted beyond recognition. But he's not alone. Ghostly figures close in, trapping anyone who dares to stay. St. Paul's Hospital in Minnesota had been standing for over a century. It was a towering building, ominous in its very structure, with weathered brick walls and windows that seemed to stare into the abyss. Despite its grandiose appearance during the day, the hospital's eerie reputation grew at night. Those who had worked the late shifts spoke in hushed tones about the unexplainable sounds, the shadows that moved when no one was around, and the feeling of being watched from unseen corners. There was one man, however, who knew more about the horrors of St. Paul's than anyone. His name was Jimmy Parker, and he had been the night janitor at the hospital for the past 8 years. To anyone who might have asked, Jimmy appeared like any other ordinary man. He was in his 40s, with graying hair and a limp from an old accident. His uniform was simple, a faded blue jumpsuit with a name tag that in better days. Jimmy wasn't known for his conversation skills. He preferred the solitude of the hospital halls at night. But there was something peculiar about Jimmy. He didn't walk like anyone else. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. But those who saw him late at night noticed that Jimmy walked on his head. At first it was dismissed as nothing more than fatigue or eccentricity. But as time went on, the hospital staff started to notice something far darker. His odd gait was only the beginning of the terror that would haunt the building for years to come. Jimmy's night shifts always began the same way. As the clock struck midnight, he would slowly walk the long, empty hallways, his mop dragging behind him, the clattering of his bucket reverberating in the silence. He would start at the 3rd floor, where the abandoned wing of the hospital stood, a wing that had been shut down for years. No one was ever allowed up there, but Jimmy always made his way to the top floor, sometimes disappearing for hours before finally returning. He was always alone. The whispers among the staff grew. No one was sure why Jimmy insisted on visiting the abandoned wing, and no one had the courage to ask. It was known that there were strange sounds coming from that area at night, scraping noises, faint whispers, and an odd, pulsating hum that rattled the nerves of anyone who ventured too close. One evening, as the hospital prepared for its usual quiet shift change, the janitor's behavior began to grow more erratic. The walls seemed to close in on him as he mumbled to himself, his voice quivering with something unspoken. "They want me to join them. I don't want to. They won't let me leave." The other night shift workers noticed his increasingly disturbing actions, but they couldn't bring themselves to confront him. He had always been an oddball, but now his eyes were vacant and his movements were jerky, like someone struggling against unseen forces. But it wasn't until 3 a.m. on one particularly cold and damp winter night that things took a sinister turn. That night, the temperature plummeted and the air inside the hospital grew heavy. The hospital had been under renovation, and certain areas had been locked off due to safety concerns. Jimmy, however, was unfazed by the signs. He seemed to know the layout better than anyone else, moving freely where no one else dared to go. The crash came suddenly, shattering the quiet. It wasn't a loud, violent noise, but more like something dropping with a heavy thud. Susan, one of the nurses working that night, heard it and rushed down the hall to investigate. What she found was enough to freeze her in place. There, sprawled out on the cold, tiled floor, was Jimmy Parker. His body lay at an odd angle, as though he had been tossed aside. But it wasn't the way he had fallen that disturbed Susan, it was the way he was positioned. He was walking on his head. His body contorted unnaturally, his limbs twisted and curled, while his head was upside down, planted firmly on the floor. His eyes were wide open, glassy and unblinking, and his mouth twitched as if he were trying to speak, but no words came out. Susan screamed for help, and moments later the other staff members arrived. They helped Jimmy to his feet, though something was off. His expression was vacant, as if he were no longer aware of his surroundings. His neck had twisted at an impossible angle, but it wasn't broken, just wrong. It was as if something inside him had shifted, something beyond human comprehension. Jimmy's eyes rolled back in his head, and for the briefest of moments, Susan thought she saw something else behind them, a shadow, a dark presence that was watching her. Then, his head turned all the way around, so his eyes locked with hers. "You can't leave," he whispered in a voice that wasn't his own. It was deep, guttural, and chilling, as if something ancient had taken control of his body. "They won't let me leave, and they won't let you either." Terrified, the staff tried to restrain Jimmy, but it was no use. His body began to jerk and twitch violently. He collapsed again, but this time he rose up onto his hands. His feet, bent backward in a grotesque imitation of human motion, hung limp in the air. It was as though the hospital itself was contorting his body, forcing him to do things that were not possible. The lights above them flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The temperature in the room dropped so rapidly that Susan could see her breath. And then, from the dark corners of the room, came the unmistakable sound of something else. Figures. The shadows began to move. At first, they were just faint, shifting forms at the edges of Susan's vision. But soon, they took shape, translucent, ethereal beings with faces twisted in agony. Their hollow eyes stared not at Jimmy, but at Susan. It was as if they were waiting for something to happen, something to claim. The figures inched closer to Jimmy, and he screamed in pain as their cold, spectral hands reached for him. His body twitched and spasmed, writhing in ways that defied logic. And then, with a sickening crack, his head twisted around again, snapping with the sound of breaking bone. His body began to rise into the air, floating as if gravity no longer had a hold on him. His feet dangled lifelessly, while his arms flailed in a grotesque dance. Susan stood frozen, paralyzed with fear. The figures surrounded Jimmy, pulling at him, stretching his limbs, twisting him further into the air. It was as though the hospital itself was feeding off his suffering, growing stronger with every movement. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. The room was plunged into absolute darkness, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Susan felt something cold wrap around her wrist, pulling her into the shadows. She couldn't see it, but she knew it wasn't human. The last thing she heard before the darkness consumed her was Jimmy's voice. It had changed, deepened, distorted. It was no longer his voice, but something darker, older. "They won't let us leave," it growled. The next morning, when the hospital's security team arrived, they found the area in chaos. The lights still flickered sporadically, and the temperature had dropped so low that frost covered the windows. Jimmy was gone. Susan was gone. The only evidence of their existence was a trail of wet footprints leading to the abandoned wing. Jimmy Parker had vanished, but something far darker had taken root within the hospital. His ghostly figure still roamed the halls, twisted and contorted, walking on his head as he had before. His fate was sealed, trapped within the cursed walls of St. Paul's, forever part of the malevolent forces that haunted the place. From that night on, no one worked the night shift. The hospital's doors were eventually shut, its halls abandoned. But some say that if you stand at the entrance on a cold winter's night, you can still hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing within. If you listen closely, you'll hear Jimmy's voice, his chilling whisper from the darkened corners, "They won't let us leave." As the years passed, the haunting of St. Paul's Hospital remained etched in the minds of those who dared to speak of it. The building, now abandoned and crumbling, stood silent, its walls soaked in the darkness of forgotten horrors. The twisted fate of the night janitor, Jimmy Parker, and the chilling spirits that had claimed him were not just stories, they were warnings. The memories of those who entered its gates lingered in the air, heavy with dread. No one truly knew what had happened to Jimmy, but those who ventured close could still feel his presence, could still hear the eerie sound of footsteps that weren't their own echoing in the halls. Some believed Jimmy had become part of the haunting, his twisted form now a permanent fixture in the hospital's dark past. Others said he was still out there, forever trapped in the very building he had worked in, forced to roam the empty halls in his unnatural state. Then, there were the others, the ones who had ventured in after Jimmy's disappearance. They came in search of answers, hoping to uncover the truth of the supernatural forces that had terrorized the building. They, too, never returned. Those who spoke of the hospital's curse told stories of blood-curdling whispers and shadowy figures that moved in the corners of their vision. They spoke of the air growing unnaturally cold, of footsteps that weren't their own, and of eyes watching them from the darkness. And so, St. Paul's Hospital remained a cursed, forgotten place. No one dared approach it at night, and the stories of its horrors spread through the town, keeping people awake with fear. The building had become a legend, a warning. But in the darkest corners of the world, there are always those who are drawn to the unknown, to places where others dare not tread. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale, be sure to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Keep the lights on, and remember, some places are better left unexplored. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and stay tuned for more terrifying stories that might just keep you up at night.